You. My name is Braden McKenzie. My pronouns are he, him. I work as the Equity Data and Research Analyst here at the University of Victoria in our Equity and Human Rights Office. In that role, I am responsible for overseeing a number of different sort of equity-related data sets, one of which being our approach to self-identification demographic data collection, which I'll be talking to you about today. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge with respect and gratitude the Lekwungen, including the Songhees and Esquimalt peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, the Lekwungen, as well as the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. Whenever we give this land acknowledgement in line with our Better Data project, which we'll be chatting about today, we're always sort of forced to grapple with a tension, and that tension is that the data that we are sort of aiming to collect and the way in which we want to go about collecting it is inherently colonial and pretty Eurocentric sort of practice. We like to sort of categorize, we like to put people in really neat and tidy boxes, and that actually goes against a lot of Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous teachings and so on and so forth. And so when we give this acknowledgement, we need to grapple with that tension, and we've had to do so throughout this project. One of the ways in which we have done so is sort of prioritizing the knowledges of our local Indigenous nations here at the University of Victoria, including our Indigenous elders and so on and so forth. But overall, it's also approaching the work from a very community-oriented perspective, and that needs to ground the work in terms of collection, but also the management, reporting, and use of the data that we are planning on collecting. So just a brief agenda. So basically, I want to tell you sort of where the University of Victoria has been in terms of our demographic data collection. And I want to tell you then sort of some of the issues with that, where other universities have gone, and then where we are going in terms of our new Better Data project, how the project was planned, where we're at now, and where we plan to be moving forward. But to start, I'll just sort of give you a little bit of context in terms of self-ID demographic data. So when we talk about self-ID demographic data, we're talking about social location or identity characteristics. This can include information on race, gender, sex, sexuality, Indigenous identity, disability, among many other categories. At UVic, we collect demographic data in a couple of sort of distinct contexts. Some demographic data is collected as a necessary piece of either the employee-employer relationship or the student post-secondary institution relationship. An example of this is gender identity, which is used in what are oftentimes sort of vendor processes like payroll benefits and different things like that. So that information is viewed as a necessary or required piece of information for the institution. The second context in which we collect this information is where it's not required, but where it is very useful for the institution to gain a better understanding of who is actually a part of the UVic community, so that we're in a better position to be able to support them in all the diverse ways and so on necessary. And so that sort of second context is the focus of my chat today and the focus of our Better Data project. And we could have a long and different chat about whether that other information is actually required, but we'll save that for another day. So in terms of our current institutional context around the information that's viewed as not required, we collect both student and employee demographic data in a couple of different ways. So for our student population, through the admission application, we allow prospective students to self-identify Indigenous identity, and gender expression as of last fall with new legislation from the province and guidelines from the province, and then youth in care status. For employees, typically or historically, our employment equity survey has been used as the place where employees are asked to provide demographic information. And within that survey, we have historically asked about Indigenous identities, members of visible minorities. Another great part of this project is we get to update our language, and I'll chat more about that. Persons with disabilities, and then that data is mapped on to gender identity information from Human Resources. And so it provides us with a general understanding of the 4 federally protected groups in Canada. So this is our sort of current context. What are the limitations of this approach? There are many, for sure, but in terms of the 4 major limitations that we've identified, the first is a lack of disaggregation. And so in both student and employee data collection, we collect sort of the biggest, broadest category possible without distilling that information down to more nuanced identity categories, and therefore just don't have a great understanding of who is actually a part of the UVic community. The second is that we have limited ability with our current system to analyze intersectionally for individuals who identify as members of more than one of the 4 protected groups. So for example, I could tell you how many women work in a particular area of the institution. I could tell you how many Indigenous people work in that same area, but I couldn't tell you how many Indigenous women work within that area. And that is vitally important because we know that oppression and barriers to equity and all these different things are inherently intersectional in nature. And so if you're not collecting your data in a way that allows you that sort of intersectional understanding, you're missing a very, very big piece of the puzzle. So that's a big limitation for us currently. The third is closely connected to the first, but diversity in this sense is limited by and large to the 4 protected groups in Canada. We just know in terms of a UVic context that is not representative of the true diversity on campus. And so moving forward, wanting to expand upon the ways in which we collect that information to better capture that diversity. And then the fourth is pretty common in terms of institutional data, but historically, institutional data has been difficult to access and use from community members themselves. So the people whose data it actually is has typically been very inaccessible. And so we want to address that with our project moving forward, and we'll chat all about that as well. So if this is what we're currently doing, what the limitations are, what are other Canadian institutions doing with regards to self-ID demographic data collection, and what about legislation? So there's certainly been a lot of momentum around these types of projects in recent years. Part of that is connected to what's called the Dimensions Project, which is being run and overseen by the Tri-Council agencies, and is predicated on advancing equity-related work on Canadian campuses through more ambitious and critically oriented data collection. As you can see on the slide, many post-secondary institutions are now running what we would call census-style questionnaires or surveys for both their students and employees. In this regard, UVic is currently a bit behind the curve in terms of our current approach to data collection. It's also important to note that there is a legislative aspect to this work as well. So from an employment perspective, we are responsible for consistent reporting to BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, who oversees our right to conduct limited and preferential hiring searches across our employment population, so both faculty and staff. If we want to expand the populations that we're able to conduct more searches for, we have to provide justification through data to say this population is underrepresented at the University of Victoria. We would like to address that underrepresentation through limited and preferential hiring searches, in which they would give us the okay, and then we'd be able to monitor the success of that additional population over time. So that's one of the sort of examples of our reporting requirements. Provincially, we have also seen the Anti-Racism Data Act, which has been chatted about over the last couple days, as well as the Pay Transparency Act come into play. As such, the updates to our approach and process needed to put us in a position that would allow us to fill various reporting requirements and be compliant with any new legislation that may arise. On top of all of this, we also have our sort of own internal institutional work, which is increasingly reliant upon a better understanding of who is actually a part of the UVic community. This relates to work on the new strategic plan, which for those of you not at UVic, it launched just this year, the Equity Action Plan, the renewed Indigenous Plan, and many other sort of institutional initiatives around campus. So with all of that context in mind, we began thinking about what UVic needed to do in regards to demographic data collection, management, and reporting. Before making any concrete decisions around data collection or even sort of a project plan or project map, we began by conceptualizing what needed to form the foundation of the work in order for the overall project to be successful. The result of that is the sort of 7 ethical principles, we're calling them, as you see on the slide here. And I'm just going to quickly give you a bit of context for each before we move on to implementation, because they have been very influential for how the project has been designed. So in terms of privacy and confidentiality, maintain privacy and confidentiality of all respondents and communicate the risks and impacts, if any, of re-identification. Accessibility, communication, and functional operation associated with the project must support the full participation of any community member who may otherwise face barriers to participating. Respectful relationship building. Identify the communities who are impacted by systemic inequity and oppression. Through collaboration, consultation, consistent engagement, and community governance, prioritize reciprocal practices that center partnerships and co-learning. Intersectionality, which we've chatted about, recognizing that experiences of inequity and oppression are intersectional and overlapping. Data collection, management, and reporting tools must allow for intersectional understanding of the UVic community. Action and accountability. This is not data collection for the sake of data collection. We're not doing it because UBC is doing it or SFU is doing it. We're doing this to inform meaningful action across our campus. And so that connection to action and also accountability was very important for us as we were beginning this planning phase. Reflexivity and evaluation, incorporate a consistent approach to reflect on biases of the project, gaps in knowledge, or shifting best practices, and commit to ongoing evaluation of the work and create space for flexibility and nimbleness when improvements are needed. That's one of the things with our old employment equity system, was that the application was built in such a way that we couldn't actually update the questions even if we wanted to. And so we really did need to start from the ground up, but recognizing that identity characteristics are constantly evolving, best practices are too. We wanted to build the ability to provide updates within our system, within our new system to allow for those important changes. And then finally, transparency. Clearly establish and communicate the purpose of data collection and each intended use of the resulting data set. Provide guidelines for accessing personal data, adjusting responses, and or withdrawing consent of data use. And I'll chat a little bit more about that as we go. So from the ethical principles, which, as I said, sort of really formed the foundation of this work, we then began a series of consultations over the course of a year with key campus partners, other institutions, and different experts within the field. The result of these consultations is a sort of clearly defined project purpose and a brand new data collection tool for the University of Victoria, and importantly, a path moving forward for really robust reporting and data access and use. So, the project objective, the purpose of the Better Data Project is to govern and enable the delivery of high quality, accessible representation data as a means of addressing barriers to equity, inclusion, and belonging for populations across the University of Victoria community. And I always go back to that as a means of, to again, really drive home the notion that this is not data collection for the sake of data collection. This data collection needs to inform meaningful action across our campus. So specifically, self-ID demographic data is collected and used to plan for implementation, evaluation, and ongoing monitoring of the university's strategic direction related to all the plans I already mentioned. The project is about gathering, getting our representation data, so again, our understanding of who is actually a part of the UVic community up to best practice standards. And then from there, there are many sort of exciting opportunities for future projects, whether it's related to pay equity or different things like that, that will offshoot. But this project, as it's currently scoped, is to get our representation data up to best practice standards. In terms of implementation, we tossed around a number of different ideas and approaches for implementation for this work, but the new sort of Better Data questionnaire, as we framed it, was developed in consultation with campus partners and different expert guidelines and experts in the field for current best practices around demographic data at post-secondary institutions. It asks both broad and disaggregated questions across 6 identity categories, being gender identity, sexual orientation, Indigenous identity, disability, racial and or ethnocultural identity, and religious and or spiritual identity. The new questionnaire is now available, I'm very excited to say, to all UVic employees and students. So employees and students have access to the same questionnaire through a permanent link in their UVic user profile. The idea is that this is ongoing data collection that people can update at any point in time throughout their relationship with the institution. It will also be built in to the sort of new student welcome so that we're constantly getting that up-to-date understanding of the UVic population. But it is a permanent link within your UVic user profile that we can access at any point in time. One of the really important things to note with regards to implementation is the recognition that when you ask people to share this kind of information, you're really asking them to share a piece of themselves with you. And with that comes a lot of responsibility around privacy and security, especially if you consider how this data has historically been used within the context of post-secondary institutions. And very briefly, that context involves sort of a lot of performance sort of management rather than meaningful action. And so we need to take that into consideration and recognize that when we're talking about privacy and security. Ultimately, this needs to be a community-driven project that cultivates mutual trust, transparency, and accountability throughout each stage. And so a couple practical examples in which we've done so with our new questionnaire are, as I said, we have built in the ability for folks to go in, provide as much or as little information as they choose with our new questionnaire, and then change that information, delete that information at any point in time. Previously, for our employment equity system, I, as the data steward, you had to actually email me and say, hey, Braden, I'd like to update my information on the questionnaire, in which you'd have to provide me with your personal identification number for the institution. I would go in, reopen your questionnaire, and then email you back and say, you can go ahead and update that information. So this is a really important step that folks can go into that link at any point in time, update the information, recognizing that identity is constantly sort of shifting and evolving over time. And so a really tangible example of how we're sort of upgrading our privacy and security in that regard. The other thing that we've done within the application itself is only provide access to aggregate level data. So while this is information that's sort of tied to your personal identification at the University of Victoria, no one actually has access to that. And so what we can do with that is ensure that your sort of confidentiality is maintained, but also give a broad picture of who is actually a part of the University of Victoria through just sums, representation percentages, and so on and so forth. We've also built into the questionnaire itself a prefer not to answer all questions option right at the top. So it literally takes folks about 5 seconds to load the questionnaire, prefer not to answer all questions, and just indicate that they'd rather not provide this information to the institution. So let's say this project is a large success and we end up having a great data set with really awesome response rates across both populations. Now what? As I mentioned earlier, this data collection will be vitally important to inspiring strategic action across campus, both in short and long term. Specifically, the data will be used for a review of support structures to ensure they respond to the diverse needs of our students and employees, with the idea being, again, that if you know who's actually here, you're theoretically in a far better position to be able to support your students and employees in a really robust, diverse, and nimble way. We will also, it will also inform strategies to enhance recruitment, retention, and advancement across the institution, including ambitious goal setting. And it will serve as a key point of evaluation of institutional plans, including but not limited to the strategic plan, the equity action plan, and the Indigenous plan. In terms of what's needed for us to be successful, it all revolves around generating response rates. For those of you with surveys, you probably already know this. but we need to reach a minimum of 85% response rate in our employment population. And that's because our employment equity survey hovers at about around 85%. So in order to replace that data set, we really want to replace it with something akin in terms of response rate. In terms of students, we are setting the somewhat ambitious goal of around 60% a response rate of all University of Victoria students. We have about 21,000 students, so 60% of that population would be fantastic. But we're also recognizing that generally our understanding of who our students actually are at this point is quite poor because we only have that point of application data. So anything that we're able to gather in terms of students is going to be better than where we're at, and because of the rollover in that population, given the nature of post-secondary institutions, we will have multiple opportunities to sort of get that number up as high as we possibly can. From a community access perspective, we are committed to building live interactive data dashboards through Power BI with the support and encouragement from key campus partners and local Indigenous nations. And what that means is the folks whose data it actually is can go in, explore the data across the institution by faculty, by different types of roles, et cetera, to see that data for themselves and get a clear and sort of transparent picture of the University of Victoria community. And just really quickly in closing before I open it up for any questions, in terms of practical examples, like I sort of just mentioned the really institutional actions that will follow from this, but there are also a lot of really practical examples in terms of how we plan on using this data and how practical it can be. So UBC is currently working to understand barriers to success in the classroom using intersectional demographic data. They're building a dashboard for instructors to understand how their teaching techniques are sort of productive or not across different populations. So a really cool example of how we can sort of anticipate and understand success in the classroom. U of T is working to identify and address what's often referred to as the leaky pipeline of Black graduate students using results from the Student Equity Census. This is part of their work on the Scarborough Charter. So understanding sort of the leaky pipeline. So as you go up in degree status, you get lower and lower representation numbers within certain populations, in this case, Black graduate students. So U of T is using the data from their Student Equity Census to identify that and then implement different strategies to sort of address it and assess the effectiveness of those strategies over time. At UVic, preferential admissions projects will be directly connected to the representation data collected through our new Better Data questionnaire. And so we've had lots of faculties interested in launching preferential admissions projects with what they sort of perceive or anecdotal evidence of representation, but this will give us the data to sort of back it up, but also the ability to evaluate those initiatives over time as well. And then finally, we're also constantly looking to expand the populations that are eligible for limited and preferential hiring searches using the representation data collected through the Better Data questionnaire, which again is overseen by BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. So a couple quick examples. Again, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciated being in this space with you all. And I think I have a few minutes for questions if there are any, but otherwise, thanks very much. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So okay, so the question was how was about retention. So how long data is retained for our online folks as part of the questionnaire. So our retention policy around equity related data is 3 years. But with this one, it's while you're active at the institution. And so when a student graduates, we will retain that data for 3 years and then the record will be deleted. The only reason for us to retain it is to because we have a lot of different sort of point in time reporting needs. And so we could look back 3 years ago, look at our student demographic data at that point, run a report, and then from so on. So it's 3 years after you become inactive. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was about response rate for students, whether or not we know what other institutions have achieved. The highest one we've come across is McGill, and they have a 67% response rate among students. One of the strategies that they implemented that was really effective was asking instructors to provide space for students to complete the questionnaire in the classroom, which we are planning on launching a Better Data in the Classroom initiative come next semester. So we're really hoping to see a robust uptake in that regard. But yeah, 67% is sort of the highest number that we've seen. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.